Okay, so I really want to say thank you so much for coming to this mini little seminar here. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and Ren Leadership, the company that I have. And then we're going to launch into what emotional intelligence is, how it manifests itself, and then also look at ways of building inclusion through emotional intelligence. And then I always do a little final reflection, and we will have a chance for questions. So in the chat right now, I love to do this when I'm on Zoom. In the chat right now, just write what you think emotional intelligence is. Don't hit send yet, and just hang on to it until I tell you. And you can go ahead and hit send, and we're going to see this all fall down, everybody's ideas of what it is. So just go ahead and hit send. Amazing. Amazing. Okay, so thank you, everyone. So I just want to tell you a little bit about myself, and most of you actually know me, but I'll just kind of reiterate for you. I've been a teacher educator, and a university administrator for a very long time. And I also am trained as a coach. And in all of that work, emotional intelligence has come up for me so many times because it is something that I really encourage my teacher candidates to teach to their students. And social emotional learning is part of the curriculum. They have to teach it, but they don't narrow it down and focus in on what we would call emotional intelligence. Instead, they're really teaching kids how to have social competence, to work with each other, to play with each other, to share toys, etc. But for me, emotional intelligence goes deeper than that. And the truth is that we're in a world where we are lacking emotional intelligence, and it is becoming more and more evident even in our everyday experience when we go into a store, or we're in a restaurant, or people that we work with. There is a lack of emotional intelligence. And I really feel strongly that with this gift to other people, we can actually be agents of change. So the work I do is with teachers, and also now with Ren Leadership, I have decided to bring it beyond just the education system. So I'm hoping to work with all kinds of different people. And for me, emotional intelligence has always been a guide, and it is definitely my passion in terms of the work that I do. It enters into every single thing I do, whether it's workshops, whether it's retreats or keynotes. I'm always talking about emotional intelligence and how important it is. And so because it informs everything that I do, it really started when I did my doctoral work, and I wanted to understand, how do we create safe spaces for children? Because I was a teacher at the time when I did that work, and it always came back to a form of emotional intelligence in terms of how people understand what a safe place really means, and how deep we have to go in terms of our interpersonal relationships to create that kind of space. So after I finished my doctoral work, I did start on this path to try to understand, what does that mean? How do we do it? And I became very involved in the work of creating inclusion in classrooms. Now, over time, the term inclusion has actually morphed into really equity, diversity, and inclusion work. And no doubt that is part of it. Absolutely. It's 100% part of it. But I'm focusing on how we bring people in, no matter who we have in front of us. And that applies in the classroom, and it applies in the workplace. So all of the things that you said about emotional intelligence are all things that are very powerful and very much needed in our world. And so Daniel Goleman is perhaps the person people most equate emotional intelligence with. He's not the originator of emotional intelligence, but he's certainly a guru, considered to be a guru. And what he says is emotional intelligence refers to a different way of being smart. EQ, or emotional intelligence, is a key to high performance, particularly for outstanding leadership. And when I talk about leadership, I talk about all kinds of different leadership. It's just not necessarily related to the business world. We have leaders in all parts of our lives. So it's not your IQ, but rather it's how you manage yourself and your relationships with others. And he believes, and when I saw this quote, I thought, I 100% believe this too. By teaching people to tune into their emotions with intelligence and to expand their circle of caring, we can transform organizations from the inside out and make a positive difference in the world. And how great would that be? So when we're exploring our emotional intelligence, it's important to know that right now, for the last many years, EQ is the key indicator for success. It's not our IQ, as many people once would have believed. It is our way of working with others, and that definitely impacts. Of course, IQ is an important component, but it is our relationship building, our ability to manage and resolve conflict, etc., that is going to make us more successful. We also should know that there's a strong connection between our hearts and our minds. We don't operate separately, they work together. The components of EQ are like pieces of a puzzle. They simply fit together. And in our lives, we go through periods of time when we're really high in our emotional intelligence. But the truth is, we all experience different experiences that we fade in and out of it. So in terms of learning about it and maintaining our emotional intelligence, this is what's going to help us tremendously in our lives. And so what we want to know as well is we can work with our EQ to utilize our strengths and to improve our areas of challenge. This isn't something that we are born with and it's never going to change. We work with it over time. And in fact, it's one of the areas that is probably the most sought after in terms of the C-suite in big organizations. They want to understand emotional intelligence. So you will find many people in that C-suite who are getting the emotional intelligence assessment and then being coached on it. And in teaching, like I said, it's not something that's necessarily called emotional intelligence, but they are dealing with social emotional learning. And the truth is, we can all become agents of change. And so I like to use this model that is developed by Multi Health Systems. And I know Sarah is also familiar with this model. And what they tell us, and this, by the way, is an assessment that many corporate people will use to assess their own emotional intelligence and that of their teams. And so emotional intelligence, according to Multi Health Systems, has 5 major components: self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal, decision-making, and stress tolerance. And I really like this model because it's much broader than many of the other models that I've seen. And it incorporates these subcomponents, which I think are so important. So as I'm going through, I want you to be thinking, how do I fit in here? Or how do I express these different components? Where do I sit on this scale? So under the category of self-perception, we have self-respect or self-regard. So how do we feel about ourselves? And I have to share with you, the other day I had, I was working with my teacher candidates, and I asked them to sort of set an intention for the next little while because they're going out to practicum. And I would say in this one cohort of 30 teacher candidates, 25 of them said they want to learn to be less hard on themselves. And I thought to myself, wow, that is a huge number. And this is an area, self-respect or self-regard, that they might want to work on. And of course, one of the ways we can work on that is through our self-actualization. So self-actualization sits right at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And what Maslow would have said is we are actually self-actualizing all throughout our lives. So what are we doing to improve our self-regard, to improve our self-perception? Are we taking courses? You're all here taking this mini webinar here. So that's a self-actualization. Are you reading books? Are you watching YouTube channels? Are you joining in conversations that are going to really open up your eyes? So all of this to say that we're improving our self-perception through self-actualization. And then this one and the next one for me are so important in today's world: emotional self-awareness. So we know that emotion is very tied to us. We have up to 400 emotions a day, and that happens pretty quickly. And what we want to understand is, are we aware, and even can we name the emotion? It's actually quite interesting that if we are not aware, some people really don't understand what the emotion is. Maybe they haven't learned it earlier in their life. Maybe they haven't seen it modeled for them. And so it's very hard for them to be aware of emotion when it starts to arise. But yet, this particular component is really going to help us with our self-perception. And the next one, self-expression. So here's where we're really getting into the area of how we are with others. How do we express emotion? Can we express it on a regular basis? Can we express it in socially appropriate ways? Because if we don't, this is going to really harm our self-perception, but it's also going to prove to have challenges for us in our physical and emotional health. Because if we're suppressing emotion, that can be dangerous for us in terms of our stress tolerance and in terms of our physical and emotional health, like I said. And so as we learn to express our emotion, can we do that in assertive ways? Can we assert ourselves in order to get our needs and wants met? Or are we aggressive? Do we have that sort of me mentality? I'm going to get out there, I'm going to prove my point, and I'm going to fight for what I need? Or are we that passive person that sits back and can't get their needs and wants met because they let people walk all over them or take advantage? So worse yet, the passive aggressive person who is very manipulative. So we want to look at, how are we at expressing ourselves? Can we get our needs and wants met in an assertive way? And I'm going to talk about independence. I find this so interesting from my perspective of being a teacher educator. When I go in and out of classrooms to observe my teacher candidates teaching, what I see, and I would say this is easily for the past 10 years, what I see is kids who lack independence. They sit back, they wait for somebody to give them the go-ahead. They're not risk takers. Lots of times they just simply give up because they don't have the independence to carry on. So when I'm talking to my teacher candidates, I really, really feel strongly about this, and I'm talking to them about ways they can give independence to kids. So we probably know a lot of adults who are not independent as well. Somewhere along the road, they haven't picked that up. As I said, not risk takers, not able to stay with the game, instead giving up. And so thinking about independence, when we have people who are dependent on us, whether it's for problem solving, whether it's for just simply in our relationships, getting things done or being together, if we have a lack of independence, it's going to be a challenge in any relationship. The next one, the interpersonal. And I love this one because this is what we do. We don't live in caves in the Himalayas. Instead, we are social beings. We have to have interpersonal relationships. And we have people who are introverts. We have people who are extroverts. And now we have people who would identify themselves as ambiverts. So they're a little of this and a little of that. And of course, our introversion and extroversion changes over time with our experience, etc. but we have to get along in the world. So when I'm talking about introversion, I'm talking about giving someone who's an introvert some skills to be comfortable working with others, to be comfortable around other people. And the extroverts, giving them opportunities to spend time by themselves, because that's a person who gets their energy from other people. But the truth is, finding some time for self and being okay with that is very important. So how do we develop and maintain interpersonal relationships? And then the next one here, empathy. I just feel our world just needs a huge dose of this right now. And we also need people to understand the difference between empathy and sympathy. Empathy is really about putting yourself in the shoes of others. It's about trying to understand them, even though we may not have had the experience. We simply are there for them. We are good listeners for them. We're not feeling sorry for them. Most people do not want you to feel sorry for them. But empathy is different in that it's just about us trying to understand and asking them what they need from us. It's not about giving unsolicited advice, or it's not really about trying to do things for people. It's just being a good listener. And I will say that now what I see, because we're so locked into devices, people walking down the street, bumping into each other because they're on their phones, absolutely no interpersonal interaction sometimes. The idea of listening has become even more important now. And so within my workshops, and certainly with my teacher candidates, I teach about listening from an empathetic perspective. And the way I do that is teach people to listen with their eyes, ears, and their hearts. And so they listen with their eyes. In North America, we value eye contact. We have to be culturally sensitive because not every culture values that, but absolutely eye contact. We listen with our ears unless we have a hearing impairment, in which case we listen with our eyes. So we're hearing what's coming in, but more importantly, we're listening with our heart. We're not judging, we're not blaming, we are simply listening in order to understand. So along with empathy, I think it's really important to talk about the power of listening. And the next one there, I think, again, very important in our world right now. So social responsibility. How responsible do you feel to larger groups, to the entire world even? So I know Stacy is very involved in climate action, a huge social responsibility. Other people are involved. Many of us on this call are part of a women's club, and I feel like we're all socially responsible to each other. So the idea that, do we get involved? Do we volunteer? Do we donate to charity? Do we help others out? It can be that global scale, but can also be on a smaller scale. How socially responsible are you to your small family grouping, or your friendship groupings, or the teams with whom you work? Do you feel that sense of responsibility to each other? And how can we work together? And as I said earlier, for me, this is also a big one because I value inclusion so much. So I want to work at how we can help people to feel responsible to each other. The next major component of decision-making there includes problem solving. And going back to what I said about schools, when I said I don't see a lot of independence, I do not see a lot of problem solving and decision-making in schools. Kids are really stuck in this area. And yet problem solving is so incredibly important in our lives. So do we actually sit down and figure it out ourselves, or maybe even in collaboration with others? It's not necessarily that we have to just have ourselves, because nothing wrong with asking for help. But can we solve problems? Or do we sit back and wait for somebody else? Or do we get into the position where we become so stressed out about making solving the problem or making the decision that we actually just shut down? And that's what happens with kids sometimes. You know, often I think what happens is parents, because they're so busy, they're working, rushing out of the house, that they do things for their student or their children instead of giving them choice, giving them opportunities to do things themselves. And so if that's the way you've been raised, it's going to be hard as an adult. But yet there are so many problems in the course of a day that we have to solve. Some of them are quite minor and others are quite big. So we have to develop that way of doing it. The next one there, reality testing. So we might say, do you see the world through rose-colored glasses? Do you have this idea that everything's all just great and nothing's wrong? I've got my perspective and everything's fine. Or do we sit back and say, is this really true? Or can we ask for someone else's perspective to help us to see the reality? Because the truth is sometimes we can get into viewing everything with tunnel vision. And nothing, as I said, nothing wrong with stopping and asking for help, because sometimes we don't see it, especially when emotions are involved. We can really get into tunnel vision. So stepping outside yourself, checking it out, checking with others. Am I seeing it the proper way? The last one there, impulsivity. And when I talk to teachers about this and parents, I say impulsivity is a developmental thing. Not everybody is going to be free from impulsivity. It's something that develops over time. But there comes a time when we need to be able to stop and think, maybe check our reality. And in order to solve the problem, give ourselves a little space to really think about, okay, should I make this decision or shouldn't I? Instead of jumping in and then dealing with the consequences later. And I will say, when I did the emotional intelligence assessment, impulsivity, I'm going to own this, is my lowest score. And when the coach asked me about it, how I felt about that, I said, well, I don't think I'm impulsive. I think I'm spontaneous, and I am spontaneous, those of you who know me. But the truth is that has gotten me into trouble over time. So I really have worked on this aspect of my EQ, because I know that it is important to put that impulsivity aside sometimes. And our last component there of stress tolerance, how incredibly important is this in our day? I don't think we can say we know anybody who is totally stress-free. We live in a world that puts increasing demands on us, demands in terms of our work, demands in terms of, everybody talks about how expensive things are and how salaries aren't matching that. That's a stress. We may have people in our lives who create stressful situations, and it's about how do we tolerate that? And so in terms of the emotional intelligence model here, we talk about developing flexibility. Flexibility is huge, and we learned that big time over COVID. So many businesses, many people had to, that term was always pivot. If we didn't have that ability, it became very hard. Many businesses went out of business. Many people lost salary, lost income, because that flexibility wasn't there. If our mindset is, I have to do it this way, it can't be done any other way, it's going to get us into trouble, and it's certainly going to increase our stress, because flexibility and the ability to go with the flow is going to help our stress. It's not going to take it away, but it's definitely going to help us in terms of how much we can tolerate. The next one there, stress management. So what do we do for our stress? Do we work out? Do we eat properly? Do we go for walks? Do we spend time in nature? Do we practice mindfulness? All of those kinds of things. Or are we that person who sits back and is just thinking, well, no, I'm just going to eat my way through this? And I have to say that it's not. Some people, of course, do. They have this beautiful diet regime and exercise regime, and they're not giving it up for the world. But many of us are, occasionally we eat too much. Occasionally we might have one glass of wine too many. There's occasions when we're going to fall out of our stress management program. But if we look at this big picture, generally speaking, we're good at walking or eating properly, getting lots of rest, doing all the things that help us, that's really going to help us. And then for me, I love to end with this one because it's a sense of optimism, a sense of a bright future. How do we experience what's coming for us? Are we that glass is half empty person, or are we the glass is half full person? And so the way we see our world is really important, and it really does add to our stress level. You hear a lot of people talking about the importance of gratitude. So gratitude for whatever we're doing, many people keep daily gratitude journals, etc. That's really going to help us develop optimism. I would say also staying away from those negative Nelly people is going to help us with our optimism, because these are all things that are going to get us through. So these 5 major categories and the 15 subcategories are all part of our emotional intelligence. They are all things that we can work on. We can look at each particular individual one and say, yeah, I'm really strong here, but I need to work on this. And after this workshop, I'm going to send all of you a little booklet with all the components there that will give you some ideas for how to work on each different component. And I think the other important thing to think about when we're talking about our own emotional intelligence is to think about, or to give ourselves permission to not have 100% score in every single one of these things. The truth is, there's many reasons why we are the way we are. It's the way we were raised. It's the experiences we've had, the relationships that we've had. All of these things go in. So maybe at some level we missed out on something, but the great news is the game is not over. We can just keep going. So some keys to building inclusion. So this, to me, inclusion applies to absolutely everything in the way that I speak about it. Of course, it's, as I said, that equity, diversity, and inclusion, but I think it's just broader than that when we talk about inclusion. And we all want to build inclusion with our families, with our friend groups, with our people that we work with. But we can't just do that because we are a family or a friendship group. It doesn't just happen. It has to be intentional, and it takes time to really develop this. Now, I may not do this with my family, but I do know that some people do develop an alliance. I always develop an alliance with groups I'm working with, whether I'm working with them for an hour or two, or whether I'm working with them over a long period of time. And the alliance is really us trying to figure out together, collectively, how do we want to be together? So when I do that with my groups, I talk about them thinking about things that are important to them. And it's almost always how they want to be treated. So things like attentive listening, mutual respect, all of those kinds of things are going to come up when I design an alliance. And then it's there for us, and we can keep going back to it. And if someone doesn't live up to the alliance, we can call them on it, because it's a boundary. And certainly in terms of our workplaces and me with my teacher candidates, this has always been something important, because people fall asleep or they forget. So we can go back and we can say, remember, we talked about mutual respect. Are we all practicing mutual respect right at this moment in time? And the next thing I want to talk about is actually building in inclusion strategies. I really find it interesting when I hear, and this I hear mostly in the corporate world or the business world, where they will say, we're going to build inclusion. And what their idea of inclusion is, we're all going to go out for dinner, and then we're going to go to see the Leafs play, let's say the Toronto Maple Leafs. For those of you who aren't in Canada, the Toronto's hockey team. Well, first of all, we go out for dinner, we sit at a long desk, or a long table rather, and half the people can't see the other people. So there's, only half of the people are able to talk to the other half. And then we go to an event where there's no talking. So that's not inclusion. That's, we're going to dinner and then going to see a hockey game. Inclusion is much deeper. It's giving people the opportunity to really sit and get to know each other. It's not an icebreaker where we're up dancing like chickens and everybody's laughing. It's building time for people to talk. Sometimes these inclusion activities are going to be fun, but sometimes they're really just opportunities to really get to know each other, to break down the barriers. I took a leadership course a number of years ago, and I learned this term that I think is so brilliant, because building inclusion is about building an intimacy with each other. And the term that I learned was into me see. And that's what inclusion is. We could literally have worked with somebody for 20 years and not really known them unless we've been intentional, taken the time, and actually done some inclusion strategies. So when I work with groups, I use a lot of those strategies to bring them in. I do this program in my other company, Hearts and Minds Matter, and the first morning of that program is all about inclusion. And oftentimes these are teachers coming together who've never met each other before. And I would say in all of those years doing that training, by lunchtime of that first day, they have built a fairly strong community, and they're already talking about things they normally wouldn't talk about with just anybody. And it's because we've intentionally built that community. But the truth is, it's not something you're going to do in an hour and that's the end of it, or in a morning, or even a day. We have to keep going back to this intentional inclusion process, have it happen over time. And another very important piece, and this piece I can't stress enough, when we talk about one of the other things that I really do a lot of work in the area of trauma, and trauma exists everywhere. It doesn't mean that we have to know what the trauma is or how it happened. We just have to know that within our communities, trauma has existed, or it does exist. And so what I talk to my teacher candidates about, because they're going to have students of trauma, is to empower them and give them voice. This is the same in every aspect of our lives. We need to empower each other and give each other voice. So important to including community. So some further ones are that when we do this kind of work, what develops is that we are able to meet each other differently. And that is with empathy. When we allow ourselves to get to know each other, which becomes an emotional intelligent way of being, an emotionally intelligent way of leading, we are going to meet them with empathy, trying to understand who they are. What's important for us to know is that emotion precedes thought. There is a very strong mind-body connection. And the reason I talk about this is because we are going to feel something in our body long before the thought comes out of our mouth. And well, maybe not long before, but it's going to come out in an emotion first. So when we work, and I'm particularly interested in mindfulness practice, because when we work together with mindfulness, we can start to feel the feeling, and that's going to help us slow down if we're about to say something we don't mean, or something that's maybe too aggressive, that kind of thing. When we make that mind-body connection, it really helps us improve our communication and conflict resolution. Because unexpressed emotion can create huge challenges. If we're not expressing something, and this may have happened to you, it's certainly happened to me, where I don't express something, and then it leads to conflict because I'm now building all of this stuff up inside of me, and it's going to come out in an inappropriate way. And so thinking about how, when we express our emotions on a regular basis, we're talking, getting our needs and wants met, we're being assertive, etc., we're expressing properly in socially appropriate ways, the conflict is going to be reduced. Communication and conflict resolution rely on emotional expression. I mean, how many times have you seen somebody who's an amazing communicator, and they are doing all of the things that we've talked about? They've got all that emotional intelligence components all put together in a great package. They listen with their eyes, ears, and their hearts. And even when conflict arises, instead of looking at that as a bad thing, they're looking at it as an opportunity versus the person who does not express emotion, who sits back, waits for the conflict, and then it's very challenging to resolve or even simply manage it. The other thing that is important to understand when we talk about building inclusion and community is understanding that our emotion depends on language to perceive and express. So if someone doesn't have the language, if we're in communication with someone who doesn't have the emotional intelligence, it doesn't mean to say we're going to blame or judge or be angry with them. What it means is we have to understand they don't have the language. And so we can work with that. We can help them through the communication. And then finally, their cultural sensitivity is probably one of the biggest things that we need in the especially if we're in the Greater Toronto area. So a couple of you are not, but in the Greater Toronto area, it is the most culturally diverse area in the world. So cultural sensitivity is a huge thing for us. And we need to understand that not all cultures express things the way we do. And, you know, Stacy here from Barbados, I felt a difference in culture in Barbados than I would when I'm here in Canada. And we were talking earlier about the difference in the UK. It's not hugely different, but there is a difference. So the more we can understand cultural sensitivity, because again, right now in our world, we're seeing an increase in racism. We're seeing an increase in all the isms that are going on. And that's because people have not developed this skill of sensitivity. So I just I actually am finishing a little bit early here, but I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what I do. So I have many emotional intelligence workshops that I would do online or face-to-face. I also do this work called Personality Dimensions, which is really a fun workshop to do. It's about your personality and how we work together with personalities. And this really helps when we're talking about inclusion, building teams, and working together, because we can see the personality of other people and we can really understand what their needs are and what our needs are and what buttons we should stay away from and how we can really validate each other. Mindfulness, I've been a mindfulness practitioner for over 20 years, and I will say my work in mindfulness and my daily practice has saved my life many times. And that's really, for me, what mindfulness has done has increased my awareness of my own emotional intelligence, because we are able to do practices. Mindfulness isn't simply about meditation. While that is a part of it, there's many other aspects to mindfulness. So it really teaches us how to be with the present moment and how to make decisions that are mindful as opposed to, you know, that sort of aggressive or passive way of doing things. And then EQ and personality dimensions assessments, a debrief and coaching. I do keynotes and I also do retreats. The retreats, while not specific to emotional intelligence, certainly is an opportunity to work on emotional intelligence. So just to let you know, those are my offerings. And so we're going to do another chat waterfall before we end. So if you would just put into the chat your thoughts and don't hit send until I tell you to, and I'm going to stop the recording now.